Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. All right, so I'm looking at my audio levels. Things look all right. I'll give an early heads up that one of the things I was playing with is trying to set it up so I could hear the plane while also flying and while also streaming audio. And I think I have a system that works, but part of it means that I don't get feedback on my own voice audio level. So I see it in a visual representation, but I can't actually hear how it balances. So if it sounds like I'm super loud or super quiet relative to anything else going on, definitely shoot a message in the chat. I appreciate the feedback. But so far it looks so good, so let's get going here. So I'll start with my kind of normal opening bit here, a bit of information about the stream and what we're about to do. So hello, welcome. I'm Jules, and I am a real-life CFI, and we'll be working through in these lessons all of the content that you would be covering if you were working on your private pilot's license. This would be sort of an initial pilot's license you might get. From essentially never having flown before all the way through passing your final check ride, which would be everything that's covered in the private pilot airman certification standards. I also want to mention that when you're learning to fly, the best and really the only way to learn to fly is to work with a CFI one-on-one in a real airplane. So I'm excited to be covering these topics, and hopefully there'll be bits and pieces of information that'll help you improve either your sim flying or your real life flying. But if you're interested in getting a pilot's license, the best thing to do is to go to your local airport and set up a demo flight with a CFI on the field, or maybe at a local flight school or flying club. So I'm happy that you might pick up a couple of things from our lessons here, but really the only way to learn to fly is to work with your own CFI, and they'll be able to give you feedback on specifically areas you need to work on, or things that are going really well that maybe you can spend less time on. As you've already seen from our past lessons here, I sort of go at a pace which is essentially just kind of explaining and demonstrating the different maneuvers, but then that's sort of where it ends. Where of course if you were really learning to fly, then there would be a handoff of the controls, and then you as the student would get to go and practice them and work on those skills. Speaking of these lessons, the lessons do build on one another, but if you're just joining for a periodic one here or there, hopefully you'll still pick up some useful tidbits. I try to keep that in mind when I design the different lessons that we're going to cover, so that each individual one, even out of order, even with none of the background, is still at least useful and interesting. The older videos, the most recent ones are still on Twitch, but the older ones are up on YouTube. There's a link to that page on the Twitch About page. Otherwise, I will post the YouTube link here. So that's a good place if you want to see some of the older videos. And then if you have any questions that come up during the stream, you're always welcome to post in the Twitch chat, and I'll be monitoring that and trying to answer any questions that emerge. But if anything comes up after the fact, feel free to join the Discord and you can post questions in there. All right. We'll be doing another bit of VR flying today, and like I said, I changed the audio setup a little bit so I could hear the airplane better while I'm flying in VR. And I've also changed some of the under the hood bits of how the audio works. So essentially a way of saying that there's liable to be more bugs today in the actual stream. I think I've worked out all the oddities, but yeah, keep me posted if you notice anything or anything else in general. Feedback both on the stream itself, but then also the lesson content is really helpful. So if there's a concept you're not understanding or something you want me to spend more time on, always happy to dive more into it. Last thing I'll mention before we flip over to the kind of lesson content is when I am flying in VR, I can't see the Twitch chat, so I'll pause periodically and go and check up on it. But if you have any questions while I'm flying, post them in there and I'll get back to them relatively quickly. All right, so for the lesson today, we're talking about spin awareness and spin recovery. So let me switch over here to the notebook and iPad view. Okay, good. Hearing audio sounds good so far, and shoot saying sounds good. All right, great. So today we're going to be covering spin awareness and spin recovery. And I wanted to mention the sim, Microsoft Flight Sim, I think does this worse than almost anything else. So we'll talk about all the contents of the lesson. We'll talk about the recovery procedure. We'll actually go out and fly it, and we'll fly in VR so you can see sort of what I'm looking for and what I'm doing to respond. But I was really disappointed when I was, I think okay. My VR headset just fell asleep, so my whole screen went black. But we're back now. But anyway, I was really disappointed in Microsoft Flight Sim's modeling of a spin. And in some respects, I get it because the aerodynamics are a little unusual. I mean, it's the same aerodynamics, but like that edge case isn't something that they would necessarily spend a bunch of time trying to get just right. So I was able to enter a spin in the 172. We can do the recovery and all seems well. But you'll notice when we stall, the airplane almost seems to, and you may have noticed this in your own flying in Microsoft Flight Sim, but the airplane almost seems to like it almost seems like it hangs, like it doesn't have any weight to it in a way. And I don't exactly know what it is about their modeling that makes it feel like that, but what happens then when you're in a spin is the airplane sort of does this almost like a paper airplane coming down instead of like an actual airplane with a bit of weight to it. So like I said, I'll try and demonstrate the best I can. I'll talk about the things that are a little bit different. I'm also going to do something new today, which is I'm going to play a video from my own flying, which is when I did my spin training for CFI work. So CFIs are required to do spin training, but then also to demonstrate it and get signed off by an instructor. And so I have a video from when I was doing my own flying, and I think that's a better representation of what a spin really looks and feels like, especially in the recovery procedure for it. Same recovery procedure we're going to cover today. The biggest difference is that you'll see the airplane actually responding in the ways that I would expect it to respond in the real physical world. All right, so we'll do that a little bit later. I want to cover what spins are before I play that video so that you know what to look for in the video. The good news, though, is that the Microsoft Flight Sim, because it can show us the forces that are going on in the airplane, if we can get it into a nice spin, I'll do an active pause and we can look at the lift of the wings in the different locations. And it's kind of I thought it was a really cool way to see what causes spins. So, all right. Enough caveats here. Before we get, I think I've said now 3 times before we get into the main lesson. But there was one thing that I wanted to follow up from yesterday, and that's about wake turbulence. So I was frustrated at myself for not including a video of wake turbulence because I think seeing it in real life helps make it a very clear concept and also very clear why it's important to be paying attention to. So I'm going to need to change my audio actually. Well, actually, you don't need to necessarily hear it. So, okay. So let me go into the wake turbulence file here, which I've now, so you might remember this from yesterday, we talked about the wingtip vortices. And Flying Turd actually messaged me yesterday and sort of said, hey, by the way, if you want to show a representative video, there's a pretty cool one from an aircraft landing through a fog layer. So I'm going to play this one actually. Flying Turd, this is different than the one you sent because the one that you had originally sent, apparently you can't embed in other places. I don't know, something about the way that they wanted to do it. But at any rate, so here is that wingtip vortice. And remember, we're looking for this curling from the bottom of the wing to the top of the wing, and you'll see it pretty clearly here. So this is on short final for a runway. And so we have that slow and heavy aspect that creates strong wingtip vortices. It's not clean because the flaps are down, but it's still slow and heavy. And so we get that sort of curling of the air from under the wings up on top. And there you go. You can see it really clearly there, how the air is actually curling around. And so then the other side, you can see it curls the other direction. So that's that motion that we see here. And so if you were an aircraft and you got caught in that whirling motion, swirling motion, that can put you in an upset attitude. Sort of, it can roll the aircraft in a way that you aren't directing it to. And so we also talked about how helicopter wake can be hazardous, and it's the same essential thing that's going on in this video. Let me play this one. You can kind of see they have some nice openings. So what they're going to show is a couple of the wingtip vortices from helicopters. And remember, I mentioned that awareness of helicopter wake turbulence is really important for our airport where we're flying out of Palo Alto, because we do have a lot of helicopter traffic that comes through. So this is sort of a simulation of what that wake creation looks like. And you can see those wingtip vortices being generated by this helicopter as it's moving. So I'm going to play a video of an aircraft following a helicopter on short final. So they're doing exactly what we don't want to do, which is helicopters coming in, helicopters generating lift. It's 15 seconds into this, so it's 5 minutes, 15 seconds. And then just a couple of seconds later, an aircraft comes along in the exact same flight path, exactly the area we said to avoid. So let's see, it's been about, 15 seconds or so. Okay, and there's a helicopter, and then you can see it rolls right over. And so essentially what happened there is that because the aircraft flew directly in that wingtip vortice, it got caught in that rolling motion, and then you lose, and then the aircraft's going to roll more than you can command it backwards to stop rolling. So that's the importance of wingtip vortice avoidance. Good news for that incident. I think it was minor injuries, but in general, everything was okay from that. But that's why we avoid these areas where wake turbulence is likely to occur. Okay, let's dive into today's lesson. The objective today is to develop knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with spins, flight situations where unintentional spins may occur, and procedures for recovery from unintentional spins. A couple of useful references here. These two are really, I think, good. They're a little bit more in-depth necessarily than a new pilot may want to read, but I put them in here because I think they're really good reads. And then, of course, there's the upset prevention recovery training for the airplane flying handbook. PHAC has the aerodynamics of flight we've referenced a couple of times. POH for the aircraft we'll look at today. And then also the private pilot ACS has a section about this. Builds on maneuvering during slow flight. We talked about a lot of the same principles we will cover today in here. And actually, I'm going to add to this list because it's maneuvering during slow flight, but it's also stalls and spins. I'm sorry, power on and off stalls. Because the way that we'll set up for a spin is we'll actually do the exact same procedure we use for a power off stall. Scheduled today, so I have us for a half an hour on the ground and an hour flight. Those of you who have tuned in a couple of times know that I try to keep these to 2 hours with a couple of exceptions for specific lessons. I think today we actually will finish definitely within 2 hours. We may finish a little bit early. This lesson is one that builds on all the principles that we've talked about, so there won't be a ton of new ideas, but there's sort of a new application of those ideas. And then when we actually go out to fly, we, in the simulator, have a pretty big advantage of we can just teleport to where we want to be, and then we can demonstrate these things. So a lot of the things that would take more time if we were going to go out and really fly this, we can kind of streamline for today's lesson. So in summary, I think it'll be a relatively short lesson today, but hopefully really interesting and engaging. I think this is a pretty interesting topic. All right, we're going to cover a couple things today. Aerodynamics of spins, what aircraft are approved for spins, situations where unintentional spins may occur, the spin recovery procedure, and then practicing spins and recoveries. And of course, we'll finish with a couple of common errors. One thing I want to mention, and I think I have another line item in some of the lesson elements about this. Spin awareness and spin recovery are things that are required for a private pilot to learn. So for a new pilot, these are important for you to be aware of what it is, where the situations are that you're likely to encounter a spin or an unintentional spin, and how to recover from it if you do encounter one. You don't technically need to go out and fly them for your training at all. You need to be aware of it, you need to know the recovery procedure, but you don't need to go and have flown it. My instructor, when I was training, and also myself, feel that it's a really valuable thing to have seen a spin one time in the real world, so you understand what it looks like. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is momentarily. But if you're someone who, when we do a spin in the sim and you see the kind of motion and you go like, I don't want that ever, that's also fine. That is exactly the point of the training, is really we never want to enter a spin unintentionally. And so we learn the situations where they might occur so that we can avoid them intentionally. And so if your takeaway from today is like, wow, that was the worst and I don't want to do this again, totally fine. And then that'll be the last that we touch on spins. I mean, besides talking about situations where they might occur. You also may be someone who goes out and does these spins today and you go, wow, that was really cool. And I really enjoyed that sort of motion and whatever else. And in that case, you may want to consider checking out some aerobatic flying, because a lot of the things that we're doing today are the kinds of things you would do with an aerobatic airplane. So totally fine wherever you fall on that spectrum of options there. If you don't enjoy this topic and you never want to have a spin in your real flying, that's great. If you do enjoy the topic and you want to have intentional spins in like an aerobatic sort of setting, also great. There's no wrong way to take it. The goal today is just awareness and how to recover. Okay, I hope that is enough of a background and sort of like what to expect from the lesson. So let's talk about the aerodynamics of spins. So spins are stalls, but with one wing more stalled than the other, which causes rapid autorotation and descent. The nose may be pointing near the ground, but the angle of attack is high, airspeed is slow, and descent rate is moderate. So let me show you what I mean by that. So we have one wing more stalled than the other. So these are two figures from the, I think this is from the Airplane Flying Handbook. And you can see on this bottom one, we have one wing that has a lower angle of attack, generating more lift that is less stalled, this outside wing. And then the inside wing is not, it has a higher angle of attack, is not generating as much lift, and so has more drag. And so what that causes, and we'll actually see this when we look at the sim forces. So if it's sort of nebulously confusing, I totally get it. I wish I had a little model aircraft I could like hand wave and sort of show you the different forces in here. But essentially what happens is, because one wing is generating slightly more lift than the other wing, even though they're both stalled, one is more stalled than the other, the one that's more stalled becomes the inside part of the rotation, and the one that's less stalled is the outside of the rotation and essentially keeps the airplane in this auto-rotation spiral. There's a couple of stages of a stall. You don't necessarily need to memorize these ones, but it's good to know what they are. So an incipient stall is just the first couple of seconds of the stall, and it's as the stall is developing. A fully developed stall is where the aircraft will continue to auto-rotate, and all of the forces involved are stabilized. So the aircraft will just continue to do that all the way to the ground if you don't intercede. And the recovery is when the wings regain lift, and then you continue flying. Oh, interesting. Okay, I just saw OBS looks like it connected and disconnected, reconnected. So hopefully that didn't cause any problems, but let me know if it did. Wonder why that is. Cut out there for a few seconds. Okay. Huh. Maybe 5 seconds. All right. Sorry about that. It's interesting. It says on my stat side, it says everything's still live. I wonder why that happened. But anyway, okay. So just to reiterate that last point then. So we have one wing more stalled than the other. Because one wing is more stalled than the other, one wing is generating a little bit more lift, which means that it enters this auto rotation spiral down. At spin entry, trying to lift the downwing from the aileron deepens the stall and accelerates stall entry. So this is something that's important to keep in mind. If you're stalling, and we'll talk about all of these elements when we actually go through how to cause an aircraft to spin. But what we're essentially doing is we're stalling while we're in uncoordinated flight, right? So the ball is going to be deflected away from the center of our slip skid indicator. And so when we stall in uncoordinated flight, that means that one wing is going to be generating more lift than the other, and that is what causes us to start this auto rotation. If we were in coordinated flight, both wings would stall at the exact same time, and so the airplane's nose would just level back out to the horizon, and it would, assuming that your center of gravity is like you don't have a ton of weight in the back of the plane, which you shouldn't, then the airplane's nose will come down naturally and it'll just keep flying. So it's really a situation where you're in uncoordinated flight. And so something that can occur is if you're stalling and you're in uncoordinated flight and the aircraft starts to roll, one natural inclination is to use the yoke to try and roll the aircraft backwards. So let's say that you're entering, right? So this looks like he's entering a right turn for auto rotation to the right, generating more lift on the outside of the turn here. If the pilot here tried to use yoke to roll back to the left, so he wants to bank back to the left, you would roll your yoke to the left. That would cause the outside aileron, the one to the left, to go up, and the inside aileron to go down. The problem is that if you have this inside aileron go down, and you're already stalled, all you're doing is increasing that angle of attack, and you're going to make it more stalled. And so if you try to correct from a incipient stall or incipient spin with aileron, also I'm not 100% sure I'm saying that right. It might be incipient. I think it's incipient actually. But at any rate, if you try to recover from incipient spin using aileron by just banking the aircraft back, what you're actually doing is increasing the angle of attack on this wing that is already stalled. Increasing the angle of attack makes it then more stalled, and that will aggravate the spin entry. So you'll actually lose more lift in that wing, and then you'll actually enter a spin more rapidly. This is important when we talk about spin recovery, but we'll also play a little bit with that in the flight when we go out. A little bit of relationship to the center of gravity. So if the CG is too far aft, so aft of where it's allowed to be for us to do spins, you may not be able to recover from a spin. So that, if you've ever heard of a flat spin, that's how you can enter a flat spin. And the reason you wouldn't be able to recover from that is that if the CG is far enough in the back of the aircraft, the nose won't naturally pitch down. And if the nose won't naturally pitch down, then it may be that there is no way to get the aircraft to regain speed and start flying again. So this is a really, really important takeaway from today's lesson, is the importance of having our CG within the envelope, within the approved design envelope for the aircraft. We'll look at how to do that in the POH, and actually not for a couple more lessons, but we'll talk about this more when we get into cross-country flight, sort of weight planning and weight and balance. But we'll look at it a little bit today. And the reason it's important is that the aircraft is designed to be recoverable when the CG is within the correct envelope. But if you put a ton of weight in the back, it may be that you actually can't recover from a spin. Last thing for the aerodynamics, the altitude loss is approximately 300 feet per 3-second auto rotation. So if you think about our normal flight, we are probably doing 500 feet per minute descents. Like if we're coming in on just a cruise descent, it's about 500 feet per minute. So that's a pretty normal descent. In a spin, we're doing 500 feet per 3 seconds. So we're doing You know, I actually should have this number off the top of my head, but let's see, 20 times 5,000, so 10,000 feet per minute or something like that. Just really, really quick descent. And you'll see that we'll look at how much altitude we lose through the spin. So that's one of the reasons that when we think about spin recovery, we really practice an automatic response. As soon as you see the spin developing, you want to have the immediate response to recover the aircraft and not let it develop into a full spin. Okay, so that's the aerodynamics of spins. What aircraft are approved for spins? So you got to check the POH of the aircraft you're flying, that operating handbook. Some airplanes are approved for spins in the utility category, which is a different category of aircraft usage. So the 152, some 152s are not approved. Actually, depending on the aircraft, it may not be approved. So you got to check the POH. But 172, Citabria, but many are not approved for spins. Normal category planes are tested to recover from one spin turn only. So any spin further than one turn may not be recoverable. So that means if you're flying an aircraft in a normal category, it is tested to make sure that it can be recovered if you recover within one spin. But if it develops into a full stall, that isn't necessarily something they test. The last note on here, parachutes are not required for spin training. So if you go out and do this spin training with your own CFI, you don't need to use parachutes. There's a ruling on here for why that is. Normally, if we were going to have the attitude of the aircraft in this sort of angle, we would need a parachute. And we'll look at that, the regulation behind that later. Let me jot down to make sure that I have that for a later lesson. Okay, so we will check our own POH and make sure that we're within the utility category, and talk a little bit about what that means in just a minute here. So when we get into actually prepping for the spin training, we'll do that. A couple situations where unintentional spins may occur. The classic, so to say, and also a super dangerous place for it is a skidding base to final turn. So a skidding base to final turn is as you're coming into actually, let me just load up the sim here and I can show you. So we have the simulator and I can explain exactly what this is. So there's a slip or a skid, depends on which way the nose is yawed relative to the turn. So a coordinated turn, you're not slipping or skidding. If you are an uncoordinated flight, so the ball is off center, then a skid is where the nose is pointed to the inside of the turn more than coordinated, and a slip is where it's pointed to the outside of the turn more than coordinated. So let me pull back here and look at, so we're looking at a skidded base to final turn. So let me pop up here. I think this will work. So here we are at Palo Alto. And so let's say that we're coming in and we're flying in on base here.
Caution, inside right? TFR.
And we make our turn. Do I want to just fly this? I'm just going to kind of walk through what this would be. So I won't bank or anything like that. I'm just going to use my slew mode. So we're doing our base to final turn. So we would be rolling and not just like floating through the air like this. And we roll out and we want to be aligned with the center line like that, right? If we, for instance, were flying along and we overshot our center line, and so we're rolling out, and we come and we are not aligned with the center line anymore. There is a reaction that a pilot who hasn't done spin training might have, which is, I'm going to force the nose over here. So let me show you. Actually, I will do a little bit of flying here. So if I go out behind the aircraft here, if you fly coordinated, or if you, sorry, here, let me do it this way. You can always tell when I have a lesson element that I realize on the fly is a good idea to just show. So, okay, so we're turning base to final. Pardon my sort of really quick setup here. So get set up on a good base. And we're turning base to final, and if we overshoot, I have live weather, so it's pretty bumpy today, but that's okay. So let's say we overshoot like this, and you're a pilot and you're going, oh, well, I can just use the rudder and jam the nose over. The problem with jamming the nose over, so you notice how I'm trying to like force the nose to point at the runway. Now I am uncoordinated, so if I hop back in the plane, you see the ball is way off to the right. And so that uncoordinated flight would mean if I stalled right here, which of course I'm flying slow, then I would potentially enter a spin. So we want to be really careful as we're coming in for a turn to base to final to make sure that we're staying in coordinated flight through the entire turn. If you overshoot your turn to final, you want to do a coordinated flight to come back to the center line. You don't want to just force the nose over. So instead, if I'm going like flying along like this, I'm really low, but just for the demonstration purpose. So, we have our runway over here. Oh, I don't have that's why. Because it's a pressure. So if I'm coming around, and notice that I'm staying coordinated flight, so I have my ball is centered, and I'm rolling in. Now, the right thing to do would be to roll in so that your base to final turn is so that you roll out on the center line. But if you did go too far, this is way too far. So this would be a go around for sure because we're not even close. But you see I'm still staying coordinated as I'm coming back to that center line. If you instead just force the nose over with a rudder like that, that's where you end up in this cross-controlled situation and you could enter a spin. So, okay, I hope that was useful. So that's the skidding base to final turn. That would be concerning. Another one that where you can end up in an unintentional spin would be stretching a power off glide. So we'll talk about this more when we get to emergencies, but if you're gliding at best glide speed, that is where you have the least drag on the aircraft, and it's the furthest distance the aircraft can travel. One mistake that can be made there is if you try to pull back on the yoke to try and get the nose up a little bit more to try and stretch the glide. That will actually cause your aircraft to lose airspeed, and at a slower airspeed, you have more induced drag. With more induced drag, you'll actually descend faster. And so the first thing to know is that doesn't work. But if you did do that, then what could happen is you continue to pull the nose back, trying to stretch the glide until you stall, and then if you're uncoordinated, you could enter a spin. Another one where spins can occur is if you are climbing out. We practice our power on stalls to make sure we know how to recover from these. But if you're climbing out and you have full power and you're not staying coordinated, so remember during climb out we have a lot of P factor. So if you're not staying coordinated there, that would be another place where if you stalled and you weren't coordinated, you could enter a spin. And the last one to be aware of is an iced up airframe. If there's ice, even just a layer of frost on the airframe, it can dramatically change the aerodynamics of the aircraft, and you may end up in a situation where when you stall, one wing is stalling then before the other, and you could enter a spin. So you never want to fly when we have ice on the airframe like that. All right, any questions on aerodynamics of or situations where a spin may occur before I move on to the recovery procedure? Take a slow drink of water here. All right, then let's keep going. If you have any questions as we go, always feel free to ask. The spin recovery procedure, the generic, not specific to any particular airplane spin recovery procedure, which I will note. Actually, I'm going to put a line in here now. So the most important thing is to follow what your POH says about the spin recovery procedure. So we'll talk about PARE, this acronym PARE. This is the sort of generic spin recovery procedure and also happens to be what we use in the 172. This is a pretty common spin recovery procedure, but you do want to make sure that you know the spin recovery procedure from your POH for the aircraft that you're flying. PARE, this acronym is power off, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite rotation. After the rotation stops, then you elevator or the elevator stick or the yoke moves briskly forward, and that's going to break the stall. And then you neutralize rudder and recover from the dive. So let's talk about each of these step by step. So first of all, power off. Two reasons for this. One is if you're in a rotation, you don't want to be adding more energy to that situation. So we're removing power so that we're not accelerating the aircraft through the ground, because the wings are already stalled. It's not flying. It's just aggravating the spin. The other aspect of it is, if you remember, we have torque reaction. So if the propeller's spinning one way, the wings are wanting to spin another way. In cruise flight, the wings will keep the aircraft pretty stable flying forward, so we don't really feel that torque reaction. But if the wings are stalled, that torque reaction can really, again, aggravate the stall. So power off is the first thing we want to do, remove that power. Next thing we do is ailerons neutral. We talked about how if you have the ailerons deflected, you can actually cause the wing that is more stalled to be even further stalled. And so you're doing the opposite of what you want to do for recovery. And so ailerons neutral is a reminder that you want to have your ailerons just totally flat for the recovery. You don't want to be trying to use them to do anything. At that kind of speed, when you're flying stalled like that, the ailerons aren't effective, or they'll make things worse. The control surface that is still effective is the rudder. So even at those speeds, the rudder you can use to control the aircraft to some degree. And so that takes us to our next one, rudder opposite rotation. So as the aircraft is in this spin, we'll put the rudder in the opposite direction and hold it there. As we hold the spin, then as we hold the rudder, opposite the rotation will stop, and then we move the elevator briskly forward. And essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to we're trying to break the stall, and so we're trying to cause the aircraft to nose down enough that it gains some airspeed, and then once we have a little bit of airspeed, we can do our normal recovery. Well, it's actually not quite normal, because you're going to be recovering from a dive most likely, and so after you move the elevator briskly forward, you'll gain just a bit of airspeed, and then you want to pull up from that dive to make sure that you're not accelerating super fast towards the ground. Okay, so the acronym to remember: PARE, power off, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite rotation, elevator or the yoke briskly forward. So elevator briskly forward to break the stall. When we go up and try this today, you'll see me do this every time. And I'll try and call out as I'm doing each one. Because we're going to be doing these as power off stalls, we'll already have our power at idle, which is sort of nice. And yeah, I think that's it for the spin recovery procedure. So we'll also look at the recovery procedure that the POH has. So we're going to spend a bit of time in the POH here before we go out. All right. So our next thing is practicing spins and recoveries. So before departure, we need to confirm the aircraft's weight and balance is in the utility or the acrobatic category approved for spins. And we need to secure the interior, make sure there's no loose objects. So I was talking with, who was I talking with recently? It might have been on we have a Tuesday night social flight, which everyone here is more than welcome to join for. So the event information is on the Microsoft Flight Sim forums, so under the events there. But I think it was on one of those, and someone was talking about their experience doing spin training, where the instructor was taking him out, and he's like, "What should I bring with?" And then the instructor's like, "Just your headset. We're ready to go." Because you don't want to have your flight bag in the back. You don't want to have anything else in the plane. It's just anything loose is just a liability. Okay, so those are two things that we'll do before we go. We're actually going to pull up the POH and look at all of this in just a second. But yeah, let's finish going through this, and then I'll pull up the POH. So next one to talk about is nervousness, anxiety about spins. They can be anxiety-inducing, but they're very safe, and they're controlled if the procedure is followed. So the example that I really like is old airmail pilots, when they would fly back in early days of aviation, and they needed to descend below a fog layer. They would actually enter a spin above the fog layer, and then hold that spin and just let it auto-rotate down until they got below the fog layer, and then recover from the spin. And the reason they would do that is because when you're in a developed spin, all of the forces are, first of all, it's slow flight, so there's not a lot of aerodynamic forces, like there's not a lot of load factor or anything on the aircraft that could damage it. All the forces are stabilized, so you can continue that spin very cleanly all the way down. And then the recovery is really straightforward to then pull out of that spin. So they would use this as a way to descend below an overcast layer if you were an old airmail pilot. So very safe, very controlled if the procedures followed. I mentioned at the very outset, and I'll mention it again here, I don't think Microsoft Flight Sim does a very good job modeling this. I will show you a video of my own spin training that I think is a better takeaway. We'll go in the sim, we'll try and fly a couple of them. What I don't like about how it's modeled in the sim is the aircraft seems to like hang in this weird way. It's almost like it becomes kind of like a toy plane. And so the spin entry and the spin recovery both seem pretty weird. So just another caveat on what you'll see in the sim, I don't think is very representative of a real life spin. So yeah, and I will say it's a little scarier in the sim in a lot of ways because it doesn't work how the airplane's actually designed to recover. The same procedures used and you can still recover just fine, but it's sort of, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like an actual spin does. So, okay. We'll select an altitude to recover at above 3,000 feet, typically below 4,500 or above. We'll check for traffic with clearing turns like we always do for maneuvers. Configure and perform a power off stall with no flaps. So normally a power off stall is a approach to landing stall, so we would be using flaps as we go in. In this case, we will just use no flaps, and then we'll hold the stick full aft. As the stall breaks, we'll add full rudder in the desired direction to spin. This is another thing that I thought the sim doesn't do a great job of. So if you want to enter a spin in an aircraft like this and you apply full rudder at the point of the stall, then you'll pretty cleanly enter the sim. Enter the spin. In the sim, that usually works, but anyway, again, the physics that they have modeled just weren't that great for it. So we'll hold the elevator full aft, and we'll hold full rudder for the desired number of turns in the spin, so however many we want to do. We'll recover with PARE, power off, ailerons neutral, rudder opposite rotation, elevator briskly forward after the rotation stops, and then pull it from the dive. Now we'll pull it from the dive, add power to regain altitude as necessary. All right, so we've talked about all about spins and the procedures and the physics involved, and we'll go in the sim and we'll do a couple of spins and we'll look at the physics that the forces that the sim has modeled, so you can kind of see some of those. But before we do any of that, I want to play a video from my own training on spins. And so this is actually, we're going to go in the sim to the exact same place where I did my spin training because it works super well for spin training. And I'll point out a couple of things as we're going here, but let me put my headset on so I can hear what you all are hearing. And so a couple of things to notice in the video. One is that I do that same entry, so it's that power off stall, and you hear the engine power coming back as I am holding altitude and just letting the airplane slow down. You'll hear an initial stall horn as the airplane's first indication of stall, and then you can kind of see when the stall breaks, so I get a full stall and the nose starts to come down. At that point, I put in full rudder, and I'm actually holding full rudder full rudder in the direction of rotation, so to keep the spin going for 3 turns. So the goal in this maneuver, when I was practicing for it, was do 3 full turns and then stop the rotations on a specific heading and recover on that heading. So you'll see me do 3 rotations around. One other thing I'll just mention about the video, and you'll see this in the sim too, is the first time you see a spin, it can be very visually exciting because the whole world kind of starts to rotate and the colors all kind of mix. So if your initial reaction is sort of like, whoa, that's pretty normal. So after you do them 2 or 3 times, it becomes easier to kind of pick out the direction you want to go, and it's not as visually, active, I guess I'll say. So, okay. Anything else to call out? No, I think that's it. So here is me attempting to do, let's see if this works. Okay. So you can hear the aircraft slowing down. There's the first indication of stall. Power off, stall brake. All right, there's the spin entry. 1 turn, 2 turns, and 3 turns. I apply rudder opposite direction and recover from the stall. Okay, so specifically, notice there that when I applied rudder opposite direction, I was able to stop that rotation. Oh yeah, it is a tail dragger. Sorry, I should mention this is not the plane we're going to be flying today. I totally forgot, or I totally forgot to mention that. But this is a Citabria tail dragger airplane, and also the seating is front back, so my instructor was in the back seat. Yeah, another reason that this is kind of a nice platform for spins. And it's also, well, anyway, yeah. So, but it is a different aircraft. Same basic mechanics. And one of the key things I wanted to point out was that you saw after 3 spins, I put in opposite rudder and the rotation stopped very quickly. In the sim, I wasn't getting that same sort of responsiveness that I would see in a real world aircraft. So, just to compare a contrast when we go and fly this here. Okay, so why don't we watch one more time? Again, you're looking for that slow, the airplane's slowing. We enter rotation to the left. And then as soon as we hit 3 rotations, then apply opposite rudder to stop the rotation. Elevator briskly forward to break the stall, and then pull up from the dive. Oops. All right, so there you go. Now let's go into the sim and see what we see. So first thing I'm going to do here is actually get myself set up in the distance. How do I want to do this? Oh, you know what? Sorry about that. I forgot one critical element before we go and fly is all of our POH information that we want to make sure that we go confirm. So let me pull up the POH here and we'll go. Okay. So first I want to look at the utility category for this aircraft, for our Cessna 172 SP, and make sure that spins are actually approved. So we can find this in the limitations section, that's section 2. And if we go back, here is the maneuvering limits. And sure enough, it says in the utility category, the aircraft is not designed for purely aerobatic flight. However, in the acquisition of various certificates such as commercial pilot and flight instructor, certain maneuvers are required by the FAA. All these maneuvers are permitted in this airplane when operated in the utility category. So in the utility category, rear seat must not be occupied and the baggage compartment must be empty. So then it lists the maneuvers that are allowed, and on this list you can see is spins. So we are allowed to do spins in this aircraft as long as we're loaded in the utility category. So nothing in the rear seats, baggage compartment is totally empty. There's a couple of factor load limits that are useful to know about. So remember that the factor load is the lift being created by the wings divided by the weight. So when we're in a turn, because some of our lift vector is being deflected into the horizontal plane, that means that we need to have more lift generated to keep the airplane flying level. That additional lift adds to our load factor. You may also hear this called G-force, so that's just it's kind of the feeling of how strongly you're pressed into your seat. In the normal category, where we're normally flying, we can do up to 3.8 Gs. So that would be a load factor of 3.8, and then minus 1.52 negative G. In the utility category, we can go up to 4.4 G. So we have a little bit more on our limit load factor here. Okay, so that's one piece of it that we wanted to look at. The next thing we need to look at is to make sure that we are loaded within the utility category. So we'll talk more about weight and balance a little bit later on. And so for today, the important thing to know is that there's a certain amount of weight that we load into the aircraft, and then a certain center of gravity, depending on where we place that weight, that the aircraft needs to fall within. So this is called the envelope here. And as long as we're within this envelope for the category of flying we're doing, then the airplane will behave in the way that the manufacturer expected for things like spins. So one example would be if we, actually I'm going to start getting this all set up in the background here. So give me, yeah, okay, that's good. So if we load our aircraft such that I've drawn all over this now, let's clear this off. So if we load our aircraft at 2,200 pounds and we have our CG at 38 inches, then we know that we are within our utility category, kind of right at the top of the utility category, but within our utility category, right up there. If we had the CG further aft, maybe we have some baggage or we have some passengers in the back, that might move the CG and put us in the normal category. And then if we improperly loaded it, either we overloaded it or if we loaded too far aft, that might pull us out of our envelope completely. So what we're going to do for this flight, and I'll show you how I did this in case you want to go and practice this in your own sim flying. What I am doing is, I can pull up, sorry, let me, so I'm going to go into the flight sim here. Hopefully that audio is not overwhelmingly loud. That's all right. Okay, so we're going to practice over at Año Nuevo, which is a little bit south of where I was doing that training. There's some nice emergency fields in this area we can use if we need them. And we'll set that as our departure. They're going to have us airborne at 39 feet. I'll slew up to 5,500. Remember, we want to recover below 3,000, typically 4,500 or above that. The next thing I want to do is look at the weight and balance. So we just talked about how the aircraft needs to be loaded properly in order to do intentional spins. If it's in the normal category, remember it's designed, or it's tested at least for a single spin and recovery. So it may be that, so it should be that if you entered a spin in normal category, you'd be able to then recover within one turn. If you let the spin develop in normal category, it may be unrecoverable. A training airplane like the 172 is probably more forgiving than, for instance, a high performance plane, but something to keep in mind. So, for instance, if you go out practicing in the sim and you don't change any of your loading or center of gravity, you may actually be in a configuration where in the sim, especially because it behaves kind of wonky compared to real life, you may not be able to do spins. Either you won't be able to enter them or you won't be able to recover. Okay, so what we're going to do here is set the weight and balance. So we just were looking at our envelope, and I think I can do, does this work? Look at that. So we're just looking at our envelope. We know that to be in this envelope, we need to be at 2,200 or below for weight. So our total weight here right now is just below 2,200, so we're in good shape there. I'll mention this is not how we do weight and balance when we will do our calculations later. So I'm just showing you this so that you know how the sim has it set up. But the metrics they use here, especially this percent, mean aerodynamic chord is not something that we use in a small plane like this, hardly ever. So I'm walking you through this for people using sim because it's sort of helpful to know, but it's basically useless for most of how we'll do weight and balance in a real aircraft and how we'll talk about it later. Okay, so below 2,200 for our weight, and then we know that our center of gravity needs to be between 35 inches and 40.5 inches. Unfortunately, the sim does not, as far as I can tell at least, does not actually say the number of inches for the center of gravity. Instead, it says the percent mean area chord, which is sort of how far back along the chord of the wing is it. Puts us in sort of a difficult situation in that now we need to figure out what setting for our empty CG position would make sure that we're within utility categories. Again, if we were in a real airplane, we would do this by moving weight around or other things. So this is, don't extrapolate this to useful weight and balance for other flights, but for the sim at least, it's kind of nice to know. So we can do that, fortunately, in the POH. There is this diagram that explains, let me get to it, here we go. So you can see they actually have mean aerodynamic chord here, this MAC, and that's the average chord for the wing. Again, we basically never use that for small planes like this. You'd more likely use the mean aerodynamic chord for like a 747 or something that has that long swept back wing. But we can use it here for the sim because they give us this calculation, which is CG percent MAC equals, and then the CG in inches, arm of the plane, minus 25.9 divided by 0.588. So in order to figure out what this, I'm going to move this just so you can see what I'm talking about. In order to see what the center of gravity percent MAC needs to be so that we are at 38 inches, so that we're within the envelope here. Oops. Right, so we're going to try and get our utility category set for 38 inches just to target one, and that'll put us nicely in this utility category up here. In order to get it at 38 inches, then we can take our formula they gave us, okay, here, and we can say, okay, so we need 38 inches as the arm minus 25.9 divided by 0.58, so we have, let me get my mathulator out here, so 38 minus 25.9 all divided by 0.588. Okay, so that's 20.58. Okay, so now I know the CG percent MAC that I need, which fortunately is this top number here. So I need that to be 20.58. So I can dial this to 20.54. Go maybe just to the right of it will give us slightly further back, which should be okay for staying in the utility category. So, okay. Again, just to emphasize this a final time, this is not how we do weight and balance for our own flying. This is just me sort of walking you through how to figure it out for the sim if you wanted to go and try it. But yeah, don't take this as a method for doing weight and balance. This is not the right way to think about it. Okay, so now we've got that set up. I'm gonna go back to the flight sim here. Oh, sorry, I forgot one other thing I did want to show. And that is the recovery procedure for a spin. So under the normal procedure, so this is not an emergency procedure, this is a normal procedure for the aircraft. They have a whole write-up about how to do spins, where they're approved, how the airplane has to be loaded, things like that. We talked about most of these already, things like clean and loose, no equipment, loose, the entries that you should use. Normal entries made from power off stall, that's how we're going to do it. As the stall is approached, elevator control should be pulled back to the full aft position just prior to reaching the stall brake. Rudder control to the desired direction of spin should be applied. There's nothing else in here that I want to highlight. Everything else is pretty much what we talked about. So as the airplane begins to spin, reduce power, so there's P of pair, and return the ailerons to neutral, A. Both elevator and rudder control should be held full with the spin until the spin recovery is initiated. So that means that we enter the stall by pushing our rudder in the direction we want to turn and holding the elevator full aft. When we want to initiate the recovery, then we rudder opposite direction, and the rotation stops, briskly move the elevator forward. An inadvertent relaxation of either of these controls could result in the development of a nose down spiral. So we really want to have it be a spin, not just this nose down spiral. They say 1 or 2 spins is fine. Okay, let me make sure there's nothing else. Okay. The recovery technique: verify the throttles in idle position, power to idle, apply and ailerons are neutral, rudder full opposite to the direction of the rotation. Just after the rudder reaches this full stop, move the control wheel briskly forward far enough to break the stall. So apply full rudder opposite, that's the R of pair, and then E, elevator briskly forward to break the stall. Hold these control inputs until rotation stops. As the rotation stops, neutralize rudder and make a smooth recovery from the resulting dive. Talked a little bit about the disorientation. All right. I think they have, let me look and see. Yeah, that makes sense. So I will leave that instruction here up. Oh, actually, I'm going to be, yeah, I'll leave it up because I'll be in VR soon. So you have half the screen for it. Last thing here, I'm going to set the flight conditions to clear skies and daytime. So we'll give ourselves nice, good weather for spin training. And I'm just having a start at Año Nuevo State Park. I think there's, yeah, so you could start up in Bonnie Doon Village if you wanted to be near here, or just pick a point on the coast to start. I think that is everything. All right, let's go fly. Any other questions before I hop into VR here? Right. Got my VR headset here. All right, so the hope is that I'll be able to hear the audio from the plane, so pardon me while I change a couple settings around real quick. All right, it may be that I can't change this on the fly. At least I'm not hearing anything yet. That's okay if that's the case. So I changed the right eye here so you can see sort of what I'm seeing out my right eye instead of the left one I thought was showing sort of, I don't know, it felt like it was kind of off from what the center of the aircraft actually would be. Get this all set up.
Caution, inside TFR.
Okay, yeah, I can hear it actually. Great. All right, get my seat set up. Here we go, little view over cowling. We have autopilot on. Check everything else. Powers will apply here. Okay, lights are good. Everything else looks good. Okay. Okay, so we're flying too low for this area, actually. There's minimum altitudes you're allowed to be flying here. But that's okay because we're about to jump up into the sky anyway. So, little slew mode. Myself up. That's maybe about right. Let's see. 4,500 is okay. I'm going to jump us up to 5,500. Give us a little more space. 5,000 work. Okay. And then I still have autopilot engaged. Turn that off. Okay, so as with any maneuver, first thing we're doing is we're clearing the area and identifying our emergency field. So I'm going to continue flying at 2,400 RPM here. Looking over my shoulder, lift up the right wing, the left wing before I go, check for traffic, and then I'm going to turn around here, and I'm scanning all my quadrants to make sure there's no traffic around. Staying coordinated in my flight. A little bit too much left rudder there. Okay, I'd like to be a little closer to the coast. I don't yet see a good emergency landing field. The ones over on the left wing there seem okay. Okay. Good. I'm going to come back to the coast. So we've done 180 degrees, cleared through all of our quadrants. So we have our clearing turns down. Haven't seen any aircraft. There's a little bit of altitude here. So there's no wind today, so our wind direction for choosing a emergency field is not a factor, which means we actually have some really nice ones right there. So those ones look like they would work pretty well if we needed for an emergency landing. Just kind of slowing down here. Okay, great. So I think that'll work. In a good position here. So then I'm going to turn to a heading reference that I can see to use. So whenever we do a maneuver, we want to pick some visual point that we can make sure that we're keeping aimed towards, so we don't want to just be flying without reference to anything in particular. So I'm using actually the point of the peninsula, which is where Half Moon Bay happens to be. That peninsula that kind of juts out is right where the airport is. Okay, clearing turns. Gained a little bit of altitude here. We can go, actually we'll go up to 5,100 is fine. So I'll bring a little bit of power, climb up, a little bit of right rudder for the climb, 5,100, then we level off to the horizon, good. Okay. Right. There's a very large helicopter right outside my window right now. That's pretty funny timing. Oh, that guy must be flying right over. This guy passed because I don't know that that came through on the microphone at all, but it was loud and close enough that I will be worried about wake turbulence with the plants outside. Go check on that afterwards. Okay, so here we are. So let's start setting up for slow flight. On our clearing turns, we have our emergency field ID'd. And so we bring our power back to 1500. We're going to do a power off stall, but we're not going to use any flaps. So same entry we do for every power off stall, where we're holding altitude as we slow down. There's 70 knots, and at 65, then we let our nose come down just like we're approaching. All right, and then power to idle, bring our nose back to initiate the stall. And as the stall horn goes, and then the brake, there's the stall brake, full right rudder, and then to hold the elevator back to break the stall, right elevator, and elevator briskly forward. Hold this until the stall recovers. Okay, this is sort of what I meant about the Sims spinning is not quite right. So you notice I'm holding the ailerons neutral, holding full right rudder, and then using the elevator. See, there we go. Okay, airspeed, and then as we have airspeed, the airplane begins to fly again, and we can recover. Okay, and then we bring full power, and start to pitch up to climb at our normal VY, or we can use a cruise climb actually of 90 knots. We'll get back up to 5,000. So, okay, so, well, that was a pretty good example of what I meant about not liking how the sim models the physics for this, in that, like, you kind of notice that the aircraft wasn't, it sort of was like it was just hanging out of the sky instead of having one wing really actually curling the aircraft around the auto rotation. So it's kind of a bummer. I wish that they did a better job of that, but I also appreciate that that wouldn't be a priority for the physics modeling. So okay, so let's slew back up again here. 4. Okay, a little higher. $6,400 is fine. Okay, so I bring my power to 2,400. Turn back, looking for traffic in the direction I'm turning. Okay, good. Alright, so this time I'm going to do the same sort of thing. Try and enter a clean spin. Remember, our acronym is PARE. Power order to be to idle because of what we're how we're entering it, but that's something to keep in mind. We'll use 6,400 is just fine. So we'll come to that altitude. All right, power off stall. So we'll say we've done our clearing turns. We have our emergency field ID'd. Probably I would go to the ones actually up there at this point, but okay, so bringing this power back, 1,500 RPM, letting the airplane slow down. Again, we're not using flaps for this power off stall. I keep my heading more on point. Okay, there's 65, let the nose come down. Decelerate at 65, okay, and then bring the nose up to the horizon. And no power. First indication of stall. And full stall brake. Applying full right rudder.
Caution,
Start a rotation to the right.
TFR ahead.
Brake it. I'll go left rudder. And then elevator forward. Hold that to break the stall. Okay. Yeah, this is kind of a bummer. Alright, let me at least look and see if we can see what the forces are doing here. So, I'm going to pop out from the aircraft. We're also going to slew up a little bit here. So sorry about that sort of traumatic visual. So, like I said, yeah. Okay. All right, I'll let this load for a second. I'll check and see if there are any questions in the chat. Okay, nothing new here, so. Go here. Over to 2400 is fine. We're gonna turn off our autopilot. Okay, and let's slew up here. Okay, a little high. That's right though, there's no concern with that. So we'll use 7,000 then. I'm actually going to turn the other direction here towards kind of that tall mountain on the left over in Big Sur there. Use that as our reference point. And holding our altitude. So we've done our clearing turns, have our field ID'd. There's a couple nice ones right below us. You go over the callings okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to do the same thing this time, and I'm going to try and see if I can get it to enter kind of more of that clean auto rotation. And I may use a little bit of propeller to aggravate it and just see what I can get to go here. So this is sort of me extrapolating from how the physics in the game have been wonky to see if I can get it to behave how I actually think it how it actually would. So okay, there's 65, so we're bringing power to idle for our power off stall. Pitch nose up. First indication of stall. And okay. That's a little bit more. Yeah. Okay, so there we go. I see it's like hanging like that. All right, well, so I hadn't yet initiated the stall recovery and it pulled it out on its own, so. Okay. Well, I'm gonna try one more time here, and then I think I may just call it because I don't think this has been super informative. So there's 65. We'll do another stall, power off, and I'm gonna try and grab it. Okay, there we go. As the stall breaks, left aileron. Okay, and let's do a pause right. So if you remember that picture that we saw of that spiral descent, it's sort of like this sort of angle isn't how the aerodynamics work. Let me do this. Oop. Oh, there we go. We have a wife coming home early. Okay, so give me just a moment. I'm going to go back up. Microsoft Flight Sim. Because I do want to try and get the stall physics in there so that you can actually see how the stall behaves.
Sync rate. Sync rate.
The iPad coming through. Thank you, iPad. So let's recover 7,500. And I'm going to give it one more go to try and get a nice clean spin going so that we can actually look at the physics involved. And if not, then I'm going to flip out of VR, see if I can do it in just the 2D version. Go from there. So, okay, so slowing down here. 1500, we'll hold our altitude. 1500 RPM, holding our altitude. We need more and more right rudder, which the sim is not requiring any right rudder. There's 65. Okay, so we start to pitch up power full at idle, pitching the nose up to get the stall. There's first indication, and stall brake. Right in the direction we want to spin. Holding that. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, so I am. Yeah. Okay, so there you go. So it's already recovered, and it's going to have me shoot towards the ground. All right. So what happened there was I got the spin how I was hoping for, but then I let the ailerons. I didn't continue to hold back elevator, and so it recovered from the spin on its own. Okay, so I'm going to flip out of VR, switch to 2D, and hope that I can show at least the forces on it, because that's sort of an interesting thing to see. Okay. And I see a message in chat, so I'll look at that in just a second here. Yeah, shoots. That's exactly what I was running into. I actually spent quite a while last night practicing these to try and get it to be at least consistent enough that I felt like we could do it today. I'm kind of bummed that I didn't get really a semi-representative one. I'm glad we saw the video because I think that's really good. But that was my experience too. Is it was like, you know, and now 172s are really good trainer airplanes for a lot of reasons, and one of them is that they have really nice stall characteristics. So the fact that it's hard to spin a 172 is a design choice. That's something that they intentionally did. Part of the reason I did my spin training in a Citabria is that it's easier to spin a Citabria, and so you can really develop the spin and go. But even still, I mean, I've done spins in 172s, and it isn't like what the sim is here. And you can see sort of the, I don't know, just the way the aircraft hangs when it's stalled and spinning like that. It's not quite right. So, yeah, and then applying opposite rudder without anything else settles the aircraft. So, yeah. Okay, so let's see if we can get just flying here in the kind of standard setup. So we're at 5,500. We're a little ways away from the coast. But like that, I do want to zoom out so you can see the... no. Okay, that's all right. So at least you can see the whole aircraft, and then I need to trim some here. So a 1500 RPM as we hold. What I'm trying to do here, okay, there's 65 knots, and we'll let the power, or bring the power to idle as we bring the nose up. We get our first indication of stall, and then at the stall brake. Good. Apply rudder the direction we want to spin. Okay, good. So I'm going to continue holding back elevator here and see if we have the forces that I'm expecting to see. So and I was able to get these forces to show up. So assuming that I can recreate my trial runs, then this should at least be kind of an informative thing. So we pop outside the aircraft. Yeah, see, so that's not right. Yeah, and the aircraft is recovering now. That's pretty funny. Okay, so we'll do this. So what I want to do here is show the forces of the spin. And so I'm going to fly it actually from the rear here, which is tricky, but I think we can do it. We're at 4,500, so we're a little low to be initiating a stall in real life, or initiating a spin, excuse me, in real life, but for the sim, we'll say it's okay. There's 65 knots, bringing the power to idle, holding the nose off to the horizon. You'll see the stall, and you'll see it on the forces. There's our first indication of stall. And at the full stall, then we apply rudder the direction we'd like to rotate. You notice how the wing on the outside is still developing lift. Okay, and then the sim kind of got wonky right away. But did you notice how right at the point of the spin entry, how the outside wing and the one on the outside of the turn was still developing lift. So it had that that lift that would then cause the airplane to continue to rotate. And if you kept it held in that stalled position, that outside wing continues to generate lift, and so you continue to just auto-rotate down the spin. All right, I'll try that one more time here, and then we'll call it a day here in just a minute. So we'll go up 6,000, okay. So 1,500 RPM, we're slowing the airplane down. Again, we want to pick a reference to the horizon, so we're stalling towards a particular item, so I'll use the and there's, oops, losing some altitude, sorry, so there's 65. Power to idle as we continue to hold the nose up. And there's full stall, rudder the direction we'd like to go. Now I'm holding that rudder, and yeah. So you can kind of see, there we go. Oh, nope, see, and then it kind of just does this, like, whirly thing, which is not realistic. We can kind of see the, well, yeah. Unfortunately, I think it's more unrepresentative than it is representative. But at least at the very beginning of the stall, it was hopefully kind of helpful to see. All right, let's flip back to the lesson plan for today. So hopefully that was useful information. Again, this spin awareness, spin recovery procedure, PARE, and knowing when you're in situations where you may be at risk of a stall. So anytime you're stalling in uncoordinated flight, that would be where you're at risk to enter a spin. The places where you're most likely to encounter that would be if you're trying to skid into a turn to final. So we showed sort of if you force the nose over using rudder instead of staying coordinated, that uncoordinated flight at such low air speeds can cause you to stall and spin at a low altitude, which is incredibly dangerous. So the big takeaway from today is the spin procedure, of course, and the recovery from it, but really about avoidance of spins. We don't want to be doing stalls in our day-to-day flying. We only do stalls for practice, and so we know that automatic muscle to recover from if we ever have a stall. But you really shouldn't be stalling in day-to-day flight, let alone spinning, because that would mean you're both stalling and uncoordinated. Couple common errors: failure to configure the airplane properly, e.g. spinning with flaps down, since that may exceed the flaps limit speed. A failure to hold the full stall, resulting in a steep spiral and high airspeed. So we didn't really talk about the steep spiral aspect, but you actually saw in the way that the Microsoft Flight Sim recovered, one of the times it went, and it essentially transitioned from where you're stalling and you're auto-rotating at a very low airspeed with very little stress, and it transitioned to a steep spiral where you're flying again and you're in this really tight spiral, but you're gaining airspeed super fast because you're flying directly towards the ground. So you have to be able to hold that full stall, and that's where you keep that elevator back until you're going into stall recovery. Improper use of controls during recovery, especially neutral ailerons. Instinct is to try and lift the low wing of the aileron, but we want to have our ailerons neutral. Disorientation or freezing during the spin. Recovering from the dive too abruptly, causing a secondary stall. So remember, you can stall whenever you exceed the angle of attack. If you pull back really briskly on the elevator during recovery, you can sharply increase the angle of attack and cause a stall during recovery. And spinning an aircraft not approved for spins or out of utility limits. And just a reminder that can be fatal to do. Completion standards: client must be able to assess and avoid situations where intentional spins may occur and must be able to explain and optionally demonstrate procedures to recover from unintentional spins. No required homework and no recommended homework for this lesson. So just informational background, something to know about and avoid in your own flying. And that is all I have for today. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about forward slips to a landing. Part of the reason we do spins beforehand is forward slips are an uncoordinated maneuver. So we're intentionally uncoordinated, but flying at a high enough airspeed, we don't stall. So we'll talk more about these tomorrow when we get into it. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. And if I don't see them here, then always in Discord is a great place as well. Otherwise, I hope that was informative and kind of an interesting lesson. And I will see you all tomorrow.